James, the second chapter. And we've been looking at James, and we've stated, or I believe he states his thesis as practical Christian living, or repairing the fractured man, right? Repairing those inconsistencies. And some of what James says, James is such an easy book to read. It's so down to earth that it's easy to just read over and to miss some of those harder hitting teachings that he presents for us. But the reading that Corey read for us in the devotional reading there mentioned at the end of Corey's reading, around verse 16 of chapter 1, about the lack of variation in God, the idea of steadfastness, reliability in God. And as Christians, we look at our own lives, and if we look honestly and very intently at all, we see lacking of that consistency, that we fail. We strive to do good, we want to do good, but there's inconsistencies in our lives. And so James is dealing with, how is it we become whole, complete, that wholesome Christian that God would have us to do. So last week, we ended in chapter 2, verse 13, and we had dealt with one of the ways that we are to be what God calls us to be as Christians, that we do so, that we practice our faith, we live our Christian life without partiality, that we don't prefer certain individuals over others. The example that James uses is the rich over the poor, right? There's obvious reasons in this physical life why we're tempted to prefer the rich. They have something to give back to us, is the mindset, the thought process that we have oftentimes. But James had ended chapter 1, or as we divide into chapter 1, with stating what true religion is. That it is to visit the orphans and the widows, to keep one spotless from this world. The first half of that, as we thoroughly addressed, was to reach out, to give, to serve, to minister to those who don't have anything in return. Right? It's not hard for me to pay the bill at a restaurant, to tip a waitress. Why? Because they've provided something for me. Right? Now, the individual outside the restaurant that's hurting, beat up, is not able to provide anything for me, it's a little more difficult, right? A little more difficult to give to that person because it's no longer an exchange. That's what Christianity is based on. I'm thankful God does not give to me based on what I can return, because I'm in a sorrowful condition. So that idea of partiality. Now, as we switch gears, and I use that word intentionally, verses 14 through 26, the end of chapter 2, we are going to deal with faith and works. Or you might entitle this section, What Genuine Faith Looks Like. Or you could entitle it, if you're looking for a catchy sermon title, The Devil's Faith. Right? We see the devil's faith mentioned here in this area. Now, I use those words as we change gears. I want to ask this question, then we'll read the text and then start through it in individual. Is James really changing gears, or how far off the previous topic is James? Or are we on the exact same theme or thought process? So with that question in mind, would someone read, let's read the whole text and then we'll break you up into smaller parts, 14 through 26 for us.
What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, it's dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead.
Thank you, Russ. Want to pause and say good morning to Mr. Graff. Tammy, he's up, still active. So it's good to have him with us, as well as our northern crew, who are 6+ Jesus up there with us this morning. So it's good to have you guys with. Thanks for making comment. So is the section here that James is dealing with faith versus works? Sharon says no. Sometimes painted that way, isn't it? I think many times studying this section of passage scripture, I've got into that frame of mind or debate within myself of faith versus works. But that's not what James is talking about here. He's not one or the other, right? Let me ask this other question as we talk about what he's not saying. How far off is he from the overall theme of the previous passages? Serving those who have nothing in return to give back. It's on the same theme, isn't he? See, I think it's something that's easy to miss. I think I've missed it the majority of my spiritual life. When we talk about verses 14 through 26, we usually frame those in terms of theological concepts, right? Where you're talking about theological concepts, such as baptism versus faith only. Now, I am not saying that it doesn't have application to that. Here's what I'm saying. In context to what James is writing, that's not what he's talking about. Which for us, I think, strikes at the very core of what we're striving to be. You see, having the right theology isn't going to cut it. That's James' point of the entire book. It's about a life we live. So when we talk about faith versus works, and we talk about the works that support or show evidence of my faith, oftentimes we put those in terms of theological concepts. What concept does James support it with? What example does he give? Verses 14 and 15. Verse 15 makes it really clear. What example does James give? Yeah, someone's in need, right? Someone's in need. In other words, what James is talking about, the way we show our faith isn't simply by gathering here. In fact, I believe more and more that by gathering here, we're growing our faith, right? We're expanding our faith. We're feeding our faith. We show our faith not by just coming here, not by coming here, but by what we do when we leave here. That's a little more difficult concept, isn't it? That's more difficult to apply to our lives. But we're talking about being that complete Christian, right? Where our daily life is consistent with what we proclaim. Let's look here then at details of what James says and look closely. 14 through 17. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Now, we just got done in the prior half of this chapter dealing with the idea of our temptation to align ourselves with wealthy people, right? With the rich, with those who can give back to us. And you may recall that one of the arguments James defeats is you say, oh, I'm showing my love to my wealthy brother. And he says, if you're really going to fulfill the law of love your neighbors yourself, you're being inconsistent in it. You need to show your love to everyone. Now he's taking that a step further. He's saying, if you have faith, you're going to serve, right? You are going to provide for those who are in need. How many of you have been in this position? You're in a very difficult situation, and people say, well, I hope everything goes all right for you. We've all been there, right? I once had I was in a tough position, 2 or 3 brothers in the church came to me and said, boy, is there anything we can do to help? And I said, well, actually, I could use some help, but I have to be done and moving on by 8 a.m. That means I'm currently starting at 4. If I had some help this week, I could, start at 6. Wow, I just wish there's something I could do. And that's all right. I'm not trying to put judgment on whether they were or weren't able to. But what was helpful for me? Was it that, man, I wish I could do something for you? No. That's his example. Oh man, I wish something could be done about poverty in this world. I can't significantly impact world poverty. So does that mean I don't do anything? or do I do what I can do? Right? My brothers, so I meant to go to, if a brother lacks food and raiment. Why do you think we use brother? Or why does he use brother here? Verse 15, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed, lacking daily food. Why brothers and sisters? Why is James using that? Talk to the church. But we could, so he starts with brothers, right, in 14. So he's talked to the church. But couldn't he used if an individual lacks raiment? Yeah, or even visitors, I think, was the content. I do think he was talking about brothers and sisters as the rich and the poor, but it could go either way. It's one of the things that we looked at. How many of you know someone that's currently living in Ukraine and know them well? One person. Larry, how many people do you know in Russia yet? Few. It occurred to me as I thought that you probably have some personal connections there. What pulls our heartstrings? Right? We know there's atrocities taking place, right? And it's like, oh, that's sad. I'm not downplaying our empathy, but there is a limit to how much empathy we have for them. When you know those people, it gets way more significant. And Bob brought this up last week. If it was Main Street, Brookville, does Somerville have a Main Street? Downtown Somerville? If it was the Dollar General in Somerville, there we go. Then we get very worked up, don't we? James is using an extreme case to point this out. If a brother and sister is in need, don't you feel compelled to do something? That's his point. If we have faith, we're going to feel compelled to do something. That's the foundation of the rest of his argument. True faith is right at the heart of where we're at. Also, before we move on, his idea 16, one of you say, go in peace and be warmed and filled, without giving the things they need. What good is that? This connection between the physical and spiritual being. We talked last week about the Gnostics tried to separate that, right? In some ways we do too, by focusing solely on the spiritual. Right? We're one being. The two are connected. We can't wish them well spiritually and take no attention to the physical needs whatsoever. Nor do we do any justice doing the opposite. The two are connected. Questions or comments on those first couple verses?
Hey, Mike, I was thinking of a couple things. I think one of the things that the church had problems with is prejudice. And, of course, there's all forms of prejudice. And I think sometimes we have the same problem. I always tell everybody, if Solomon came to church, how would we treat Solomon if he came to church? If he pulled up in a real fancy car, he's all decked out, and he walks in, you see somebody that's very successful, very filled with wisdom, education, and most of us would be so happy to have him in the church. But if a prostitute came, how would we feel about a prostitute that came to church? And what would we do with the prostitute? We'd probably all go over to the guy that's well educated and very successful and ignore the prostitute. In Hebrews chapter 11, Solomon's not in there, but a prostitute is. And so a lot of times we go after the wrong people, and mainly we're judging by looks. And I think this is one of the problems he's dealing with. And I think it's an illustration about faith. If we really have faith, it works. and it comes out in the way we live and how we treat other people. And I think he's just using that as an illustration. On the other side of the coin is, if I spend all my time and doing nothing but benevolent work, that's not going to take me to heaven. Right. Now, the Salvation Army, they put everything in benevolence. Everything is doing good for your fellow man and ignoring the relationship with God. And really, they need to be intertwined. And I think this is what, and he's using this as an example. And of course, the other thing is, we always, like you said, we always use this about baptism, but really the context is not about baptism. He uses it as to illustrate a point. But he says this: if I can, and this is how we always use it in baptism. If I do everything, but I offend in one point, then I'm guilty of all. And of course we use that over and over in referring to baptism. It can make reference to baptism because I got to have a relationship with God, or all the benevolent work I do, it might be good in this world, but it ain't going to help me when I get to the next. I got to have the relationship with God. But the other side of the coin is, if I offend just in one point, and this is the point, is benevolence, I'm just as guilty as if I'd done nothing. So it's important that we try to do everything that God tells us to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Larry, I think, makes a beautiful connection between the first half of that chapter and the second half. Very well. Now, Larry, I want to pick your brain here, and because I'm not sure you and I see this in the same light, this one little aspect, and I think in picking your brain, we may all benefit. When he's talking about offending in one point in that first half of the chapter, is he not drawing out the difference between relying on the law versus being under mercy? And that by them appealing to the law, that they were going down a road that they weren't going to be justified by? Or
well, actually, maybe the royal law. Because actually they were ignoring the royal law, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. And they were, most of the time, because these were probably a Jewish church, probably. And most of the time they did have wrestled with the problems of the law. But even with the law, there had to be the obedience of faith. And in Romans chapter 1, it talks about obedient faith, a work of faith. And I think that they were separating the two, but they did wrestle with the works of the law and trying to go back to the law. But even if they could understand the law, that's the thing, because the law in Leviticus, I think, I want to say 16, where it talks about God's no respect of persons, that was part of the Old Testament. And so they just picked and choose which part of the law that they wanted to abide by. So, and even loving your neighbor as yourself is, it's New Testament, but it's also Old Testament. So, but what happened is the Jews misunderstood what the law was about, and actually misunderstood what they were supposed to be about.
Yeah.
But,
thank you. Appreciate that. So the bottom line of this whole argument is there's no separation of the two, right? And that's why it's not about faith or works, right? It's the two are playing themselves out together, for love for one another, for love of God. So he's going to illustrate this. In verse 17, he concludes what we just read. So also faith by itself does not have works, is dead. What's the example he just used? I've not done my brother any good, right? If I say, go in peace, oh, God bless you. Done no good whatsoever. That's his point. So how do we make this connection? Verse 16 and following. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? I want to stop there for 20. I meant to stop in 19. Someone will say, who's saying this? Well, James is bringing up a hypothetical, isn't he? But not just a hypothetical. It's a very real. Someone's bound to say, well, I have faith. I believe in God. God's in my heart. You can't see that. And here's James's point. Show me that then. Show me that. He's talking about tangible evidence.
You can see it like in another person's life. If they have faith in God, they will be doing what they can do to honor God and do what God wants them to do. And you will see that in their life. If you don't see that in their life, they don't have the faith they're talking about. Okay?
Yeah, there's a good point there. I'll put a cautionary note, which is an aversion or in opposition rather to what you're saying, but a cautionary note. Sometimes someone's best doesn't look like I think it should look, right? What James is talking about is a way for you to see your heart, right? And so sometimes, and I think Larry was kind of touching on this, some people, and you look at their life and say, what are they doing? Sometimes it looks different than there. But all the same, Bob's bringing out this point. It's going to impact my life. If you don't think I look very good now, you should see me without Christ, right? I look way better than I do without him. That's for certain. I think ultimately that's at the core of what you're saying. So, how do I show this faith? Well, it's by my works. It's by what I dedicate my life to. Verse 19, I think, is a lot stronger than I've given it credit for a lot of my life. You believe in God, the King James says. You believe that God is one is a little more literal. It's getting at this idea, and Larry brought up the fact that it's a heavily Jewish audience that we've talked about. This is something the Jews would say over and over in their prayers and in their worship. God is one is God. And it was the foundation. It's very much what set them apart. One of the big things set them apart from the heathens. And so he's saying, you believe in the God, not just gods, not just a God. You believe in the God. You're doing well. The demons or the devils also believe in tremble or shudder. Now, he's getting at this idea of what faith looks like. In some regard, the faith of the demons is stronger than our faith, generally speaking. Because they're trembling, right? They understand. What's the difference? Is the demonic world striving to pattern after Jesus' example? No. They're rebellious, right? They are not striving to follow after God. That's the faith, and that's what we're really getting at. Not about being perfect, as in not making mistakes, not ever being wrong. The kind of faith that says, I not only believe that in God, I not only believe in Jesus Christ as a historical figure, I not only believe that he was the Son of God and he gave himself for me, but now here's the difficult part. But I believe that's what I need to imitate. That's what I need to make my life submissive to. In fact, Rahab, the prostitute that Larry's referring to, that's the step she took. She didn't just say, oh, God's God's kingdom is going to win. All the Israelites are going to win this battle. She says, nope, this is what I need to dedicate my life to. That's the difference between the dead faith. That's the difference between the demonic faith and the faith that we're called to. Right? What am I dedicating my life to? I like to think of it in sporting examples. If a coach says, do you believe in me? And you say, oh, yeah. And you don't do what he says, well, exactly what do you believe in? Right? And I think that sporting example gets us to 1 John about practicing. What are we practicing? What are we striving to become better in? Sometimes our verbiage gives us away. Boy, I wish I'd have said, I really could have given it to him. Where we say, I wish I could have been better at being mean, right? That's the faith we're talking about. What's my life dedicated to? What am I trying to become more like? Questions, or remarks, comments? So 20, now we're going to use some real examples. 20, following. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed and it was shown, it was counted him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way, not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way. For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. Now, who's right? James or Paul? It's a trick question. The answer is yes. Yeah, they're not contradictory. Paul uses the same quotation to emphasize faith. But we're dealing with the same faith. That's the point when you ask that question or ask that question, who's right, Paul or James, that you're dealing with the same faith. Abraham believed God. He believed it long before he offered Isaac. He believed it before Isaac was born. It's shown in his life because his faith was not in Isaac. It was not even in the promise. It was in the one who made the promise, who was able to fulfill the promise. So he believed to the point that he couldn't help but act on what was going to show that. Here's the take home. We've got 70 seconds. So here's the take home. And this, I think, is what's really hard for Christians, for us. It's easy, relatively easy, to say, I believe in Jesus, and I believe that I ought to do what Jesus says, and talk about all those theological concepts, which are important concepts. It's easy to say that. It's harder to look at the life he lived, to understand his purpose, the fact that he gave his life for enemies, and to live that. That's difficult. That's what being a complete Christian looks like, in part, the part we're looking at today. Questions or comments? 10 seconds. Thank you. for your time. Thank you for your participation.